Ukraine. China's Xi Jinping is in Moscow meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine is, of course, expected to top the agenda of the three-day trip, with Beijing framing itself as a peacemaker. Mr. Xi says that China will work with Russia to, in his words, safeguard the international order.
It is true that both of our countries share the same or similar goals. We have exerted efforts for the prosperity of our respective countries. We can cooperate and work together to achieve our goals.
The meeting comes just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin on war crimes charges. Just walk us through what Xi Jinping at this point needs from Russia.
Well, Xi Jinping, by traveling to Russia just after securing this unprecedented third presidential term, he's making very clear, he's sending a message to the West, to the world, where his priorities lie. And even though, his economic relationship with the United States and NATO is hugely important in terms of dollars, that's not Xi's priority. His priority is ideology. And he and Vladimir Putin share the belief that the world order as it has existed for the last 70 years, ensured by the United States, is a world order that needs to change. They believe that the system of democracy, the cultural liberalism, is a disgrace, and they want to see the world aligned more the way that their countries are, where they are controlled very heavily by the government. And so this is a bigger issue for President Xi than just Vladimir Putin's, war crimes charges in the International Criminal Court, bigger than the war in Ukraine itself. This is about, combining the powers of these two nuclear-armed authoritarian superpowers, and using that combined power to shape the course of the world order for the future. They both believe that this is their mission, and so this meeting, these 3 days, the decisions that they make, the conversations that they have, seem to be solidifying this, as they've called it, their no limits partnership, and you see Xi Jinping trying to show China's force, not only militarily and economically, but also in diplomacy, brokering that peace deal in the Middle East recently between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and making sure that deal, none of the official documents would be in English. This is what Xi has always felt is an inevitable revival and rise of China, and he does not want the United States and the West standing in that way. Now, an embarrassing defeat in Ukraine for the West is not something that would disappoint Xi Jinping, so that is why there's growing concern that he's considering these arming of lethal weapons, ammunition, because we know that the U.S. believes that Russia might not have any serviceable ammunition before the end of this year. That's something that China can help them with, along with microchips and other types of weapons that could really change the course for Russian soldiers on the battlefield. So what happens over the next few days of discussion, Zane, is going to have huge ramifications for the war in Ukraine and beyond.
We'll see what happens. I'm sure you'll be watching very, very closely. Will Ripley live for us there. Thank you so much. And it's time now for The Exchange and a conversation with Yun Sun. She's a senior fellow and co-director for China at the Stimson Center, a Washington think tank. Thank you so much for being with us. Just walk us through at this point why you think Russia needs China and vice versa.
Thank you very much for having me. I think the reason why Russia needs China at this point is quite clear. Russia has been under severe international sanctions since the beginning of the war, and its economic partners on the international market has become increasingly limited, and its source of foreign funding, especially investment, has also become limited. China is Russia's largest neighbor, and China also shares its anti-U.S. agenda with Russia. So evidently, China has appeared or emerged as one of the few partners that Russia can still rely on in this precarious condition. Then, from the Chinese perspective, I think the most important consideration remains to be geopolitics. And by geopolitics, the Chinese would mean, well, the great power competition or the strategic competition with the United States. No matter what, and regardless of the result of the war in Ukraine, China sees Russia as a partner or as a partner that shares the same vision about the need to counter the U.S. hegemony in the world. So that geopolitical instinct really dictates China's behavior at this point.
So does China's sort of cozying up to Russia, how much does it affect China's relationship with its European trading partners, do you think?
I think it does affect China's relationship with Europe, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of the diplomacy and also in terms of the political optics. And the European concern about China aligning itself with Russia and the implications it would have for the war in Ukraine, which is why I think the Chinese are trying to frame itself or present China as a peace broker instead of a Russian accomplice through this trip. So we saw that China made the proposal on the peace settlement of the Ukraine crisis about a month ago. And then earlier in March, China also facilitated the peace deal between Iran and Saudi. So all these are giving the international community, I would say, an illusion that China is now going to emerge as a great mediator between Russia and Ukraine, which I don't think is the primary goal of this trip, and I don't think it is within China's capacity to mediate the peace for the Ukraine war.
Do you anticipate, I mean, obviously, Zelensky, I'm sure, would want to speak to Xi Jinping. Do you anticipate any sort of situation where in the coming days that Xi Jinping ends up speaking to President Zelensky?
Indeed, I think that's very well speculated, and that's very possibly to be happening after Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow. And remember, what the Chinese are trying to do is to frame or present China as a broker. So therefore, they want to present a case of Xi Jinping conducting shuttle diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine. So Xi Jinping meeting with Putin first, and then having a virtual phone call or a real phone call with President Zelensky. It will give China that image of being the broker conducting shuttle diplomacy between the two.
You mentioned that China doesn't really have the capacity per se to sort of broker a real peace deal. But just explain to us how much China's position on the world stage has been bolstered by this sort of position that it's carving out for itself in this war.
Well, there are pros and cons. There are costs to China's position, and there are also some benefits to China's position. In terms of the cost, most importantly, I would say China understands that its pro-Russia neutrality is doing great damage to China's relationship with the West, including both the United States and Europe. And it also frames China as a dishonest broker or dishonest player in this whole thing. When China presented its peace settlement proposal on February 24th, most people are underwhelmed by how empty and how little substance the deal actually, or the proposal actually offers. So that's not necessarily going to do China more favor in terms of its great power diplomacy. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese also see benefits associated with this ambiguity in terms of the Russian war in Ukraine, because for a lot of the Chinese strategists, if the Chinese don't take a position, then every country and all the parties to the conflict will want to gain China's favor. They will want to gain China to support their position. So I think there is also this argument that China should remain neutral or should remain non-committal in terms of its position. Last but not least, remember, for the Chinese, the most important foreign policy consideration is always going to be the United States. So when they think about the Indo-Pacific strategy and the strategic competition with the United States, I think the first question that emerges is that, well, if U.S. is no longer distracted in Ukraine, then how much more attention and how much more resources U.S. will be allocating towards China? And I think that's a real concern.
Right. Yun Sun from the Stimson Center think tank, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.